Mike Williams comes to town and the Jets waste no time. Don't let him leave the building. He is officially a New York Jet. 1 year, $15 million. This off the heels of the Jets upgrading their offensive line. Williams was doing today Jadeveon Clowney. Boy, there's a blast from the past. Jadeveon Clowney due to come in sometime in the next 24 to 48 hours. But as of right now, Williams is the topic of conversation. And I'm bringing in our good friend Scott Mason from Play Like a Jet because we want to talk about a topic that I've been going back and forth with a lot of folks on Twitter and on Jet Nation, and I see a lot of Jets fans getting pretty fired up. What do you do at 10 if you're the Jets? If you stay put, say you try to trade up, you try to trade down, there's no offers you like, you're sitting there at 10. Do you go with Brock Bowers? Do you go with a wide receiver? Do you take an offensive tackle? I know where I stand. I think I know where Scott stands. We're going to bring him in to talk about some of this stuff right now. Scott Mason, how we doing, buddy?
What's up, Glenn? Boy, what a what a crazy free agency period. It's weird because I think a lot of people, myself included, figured the Jets would swing on some of the big ticket items in free agency, like Calvin Ridley, or if he became available, Mike Evans and guys like that. And what they ended up doing is they sort of took the approach of let's get all these guys that are good players that we can get on 1 year deals for one reason or another, and let's roll forward. Morgan Moses a little bit different only because they didn't sign him, they traded for him, but it's a similar thing. The only one that they've gotten, I believe, so far who has more than a 1 year deal is Simpson. And I'd have to look at the particulars on that and whether or not the Jets could get out after the first year or however that works. But if you look at it, Tyron Smith, 1 year deal. Mike Williams, 1 year deal. Morgan Moses, 1 year deal. Lecky Fatu, 1 year deal. Javon Kinlaw, 1 year deal. All these, Chuck Clark even, they brought back, 1 year deal. Tyrod Taylor, I'm not sure. Is that a 1 year deal? I can't remember. But the point is, almost every single person they've signed has been a 1 year deal. So they are doing the all-in thing. It's just in a different way than we expected, I guess.
Yeah, I for one thought it was going to be a lot of time in the bargain bin. And in a way, it's been that because of how they've structured it. They haven't necessarily signed bargain bin name players, but they're getting them at really good prices. And it's exciting because, I thought maybe they would land one big fish. And I know there are some injury concerns, but really Smith and Williams, even with the injury concerns, those are big time players. Who, if they're healthy, will be expected to be, huge contributors moving forward. You're filling huge needs. You're creating flexibility in the draft. You're doing it without spending out through the nose. Really just a great approach that's worked out well for the Jets. And, as I said, Jadeveon Clowney is up next. He's a guy that I think would make sense for this team. And, when you look at the way they rotate guys in and out, and he's not as young as Bryce Huff, but he is better against the run. So you're improving in that sense. You're not breaking the bank and paying $17 million a year if you get him. So we'll see how that unfolds. But the Williams deal, I absolutely love. He's, again, we mentioned that he missed some time last year. Excuse me. If you look at his numbers, Scott, Zach Rosenblatt just tweeted out a couple minutes ago, Mike Williams has one drop in his last 160 targets. And Mike Williams, over the past 5 years, not including last year because of the injury, but in the previous 5 seasons, 279 catches for 4,462 yards, 30 touchdowns, and 16 yards per reception. I mean, that's some big time stuff right there. That's what the Jets hope he'll bring. And if he does, whatever he brings, Scott, come draft time, Jets are slated to pick 10. You and I have spoken about this off the air. I've spoken with quite a few people online who disagree with me, which is fine. I'm pretty steadfast in my reasoning here. Jets stay at 10. Let's say you're Joe Douglas. There's a tackle you like. He falls to 10, but you're looking at let's say it's any of the three. Pick the top 3 tackles. Fatanu falls. Joe Douglas likes him, but Brock Bowers is also on the board. What are you doing in that spot? Are you taking a tackle, or are you going with the tight end Bowers? And if so, why? Or if who, why?
Well, so let me first say that my friend Walter Charpinski of WalterFootball.com, he said, you got to be true to your board. And if you have the tackle rated the highest, you take the tackle. And I agree to some extent, right? So let's say the Jets aren't that high on Brock Bowers, or they're not that high on the receivers that are left. and they're much, much higher on the tackle, and they can't get a good trade that they see value in. And they're sitting there, and it's Ola Fashanu, and they just have Fashanu so far ahead of everybody else. Okay, fine, I could understand taking him at that point, because you could rationalize it as, well, they've got Tyler Conklin, they just signed Mike Williams, and this tackle, he maybe plays a couple of games this year, maybe not, but he's probably for the future. I could understand it to an extent, but I think what this boils down to now is we keep saying this, Glenn, and I don't know how many times we can repeat it, but we'll keep repeating it. This is a very short window that the Jets have with Aaron Rodgers. We have no idea if he's going to be able to play for more than 1 year. We don't even know for a fact that he'll make it through this year, because he is 41 and coming off an Achilles tear. So who's to say? And so you have to plan accordingly. And that's why a lot of these guys here are on 1-year deals, right? Douglas is trying to win now. And if you look at that philosophy, and you look at the fact that if you take an offensive lineman, he's only going to play if somebody gets hurt. And there is a world in which that tackle either isn't the first in line to play if somebody gets hurt, which is certainly possible. Like, let's say the Jets sign an experienced swing tackle, or they think Carter Warren has developed to the point where he's a safer bet to play day one, or nobody gets hurt, which isn't impossible. I know everybody thinks it is, but look, Morgan Moses very rarely misses games, and Tyron Smith played 13 out of 17 last year, so he'll probably miss some, but I'm just saying there is a world in which you take a tackle and he never steps on the field with Aaron Rodgers in a regular season game. I just feel like that's a tough pill to swallow. Going down that road, unless it's a scenario like I just painted, is tough for me. So what I would say is, if I'm sitting at 10, I would explore the possibility now of trading up. You and I have said forever, don't do that. They're not in a position to trade up. I think they are now. They've got enough pieces in free agency where I think they could make the move. And so let's say they moved up for a Marvin Harrison Jr., and you have Marvin Harrison Jr., Mike Williams, and Garrett Wilson, with Tyler Conklin, a solid, unspectacular, but solid tight end, and Breece Hall, who we know what he can do out of the backfield as a receiver. If you've got that and 5 starting offensive linemen, and again, you've got to get yourself some depth. Wes Schweitzer will be back. Hopefully he'll be healthy and he'll be the insurance for ABT, which you're going to need, but you may need another guy, and obviously you're hoping Carter Warren develops, and maybe you get another vet like a Josh Jones or Donovan Smith on a 1-year deal. But you have those guys, or you stay at 10 if Brock Bowers is there. Okay, now you've got Bowers. Look, we talked about this before we started recording, Glenn. If you look at what Sam Laporta did in Detroit last year, if the Jets pick Brock Bowers and he could do anything close to what Laporta did his rookie year, and what Laporta did was about 900 yards and 10 touchdowns his first year, Brock Bowers gives you that, and oh my God, what a home run that pick is, right? So you look at that, or you could trade down potentially and try and get. To me, if you trade down a few picks, you still would prefer a wide receiver at that point. I think Adonai Mitchell or Brian Thomas Jr., or if Bowers is still there. If you trade down to like 13 and Bowers is still there, which could be something that happens. But I just think taking a tackle at 10 is something that should only be a last resort, because this team is built to try to make a run now with Aaron Rodgers. It's not a situation like Green Bay where Jordan Love was sitting behind Rodgers or Rodgers was sitting behind Favre. It's not San Francisco where they had Steve Young sitting behind Joe Montana. You could go on and on with the different scenarios. It's not Kansas City with Patrick Mahomes sitting behind Alex Smith. Whatever it is, this team has Aaron Rodgers, and they've committed to trying to win something, or at least make a deep playoff run over the next year or however long Rodgers is here. And again, we don't know. He could be here a year. He could be here 3 years. Statistically speaking, though, Glenn, the Jets have to be smart and act as if this will be his only season, because how many quarterbacks in history have been able to be quality starting quarterbacks at the age Aaron Rodgers is at? Tom Brady is the only one who did it well into his 40s, and I think we can all agree Tom Brady's just a tad different than everybody else that's ever played the position of quarterback in the NFL. So to me, that pick, if you're staying at 10, unless it's a scenario where you have a tackle that's so much better than anyone else you have on your board, and you can't get out of the pick, you can't move up, you can't move down, that to me is the only scenario where I would really consider strongly picking a tackle, because you have got to get somebody that you know can make a big impact on the field this year. And picking what amounts to a contingency plan, if we're being honest about it, at number 10 is just, it's crazy to me.
Yeah, that's the term I keep using, is that this pick has to be a day one impact player. They are, and
Yeah.
I'm honestly, and I'm not trying to sound insulting, but I can't believe the number of people who keep saying to me they've got a plan for the future. They don't have a tackle after next year. And I just keep thinking they may not have jobs next year. And I think,
Yeah,
as you just mentioned, if we look at how Joe Douglas is approaching this thing, he is on a 1-year plan. And to me, that's sort of reassuring. Like that's comforting to me. Like, okay, they get it.
Yeah.
They know this is like, bring a bunch of guys in, try to do something this year. And if guys don't work out, their deal is expired and they can move on. If they do work out, you can try to get them re-signed before free. Let's say Mike Williams goes out and has a 900+ yard season and 6 touchdowns. You can re-sign him before he hits free agency. So
sure.
You've got these guys in house. You've got that negotiating window. So they're creating flexibility, not just in the draft, but in next offseason. And it just, when I see people tell me, but we don't have a tackle beyond next year, they may not have a quarterback beyond next year, head coach or GM. So it all gets blown up if they don't win this year. And now what does that mean? Does it mean they've got to win 10 games? Does it mean they've got to make the playoffs? Does it mean they have to win a playoff game? That's up to ownership. But they can't go out there and have another season where they win 6, 7, 8 games and expect to be back. And if you're Joe, imagine being Joe Douglas and you win 8 or 9 games next year, you miss the playoffs, and you're looking in the mirror thinking, I used the 10th pick on a guy who didn't play. My most valuable draft chip, and I took a guy, or maybe I took a guy who played 4 games, and I had to play, I didn't have a Brock Bowers or a Brian Thomas or somebody like that.
And also, Glenn, just to point this out too, remember, a lot of tackles struggle as rookies, right? So even if you pick a guy that you think could be really good, there's no guarantee that the Jets are going to look at him on the depth chart and be like, throw this guy in now. And if they do, there's no guarantee that he makes an immediate impact. If you look at wide receiver and tight end, there's I think a recent track record. Like, look at a guy like Andrew Thomas in the offensive line. He was pretty bad for the Giants his rookie year. Now, he eventually became a really good player, but the Giants, if they were in a win-now situation at the time, they would have looked at that and been like, what did we just do? So, and that's with the guy playing. Now, look, if he was going to start, if the Jets hadn't gotten Tyron Smith and the Jets hadn't gotten Morgan Moses, we're having a different conversation, because that rookie's going to start and you're going to sink or swim with him. But that's not the situation the Jets find themselves in now. So even if you think that Tyron Smith might get hurt and miss a lot of games, you don't want to, the guy played 13 games last year. You don't want to use the 10th pick playing that probability. You go out and you get a veteran tackle with a track record like a Donovan Smith or Josh Jones, somebody who's not Billy Turner, to be the swing tackle in case something happens. And then you go and you get a guy that you plan to put out there and make plays for you right away. And Bowers, to me, makes an enormous amount of sense. Look, I laughed when I saw people talking about the Jets signing Kenny Yeboah as if that meant anything. If the Jets get rid of Kenny Yeboah, it's like $200,000. Who cares? No one cares. Like, all due respect, I'm sure Kenny Yeboah is a fine guy and everything, but who cares? And Jeremy Ruckert, truthfully, he's got 159 yards receiving in his career so far, and I think he's shown more as a fullback. I think that's really where he's, at his best. Put him at fullback. If you have Brock Bowers and you have Tyler Conklin as your top 2 tight ends, I mean, number one, that gives you the best of both. It kind of gives you the best of both worlds if you think about it. It gives you a guy that can make an impact right away, but it also gives you that future potential superstar, because Conklin's on the final year of his deal. So at that point, okay, You can move on from Conklin if his salary demands are more than you want. You could bring him back and try to have a really nice 1-2 punch at tight end, whatever it is you want to do. But Bowers sort of allows you that flexibility, and it's the same thing at wide receiver, right? If you get a Rome Odunze at 10, or you trade back and you get a Brian Thomas or a Donnie Mitchell, somebody like that, then you're looking at a situation where that guy can impact the games right now, but also Mike Williams is on a 1-year deal. So for the future, he's your guy too. And you'd have him cheap for years to come, as well as you get ready to have to pay Garrett Wilson. So that timeline sort of matches up. So that's sort of how I look at it. And I think, look, the other thing you could consider now too, if you want, and we've discussed this before, Glenn, if you were to go tight end at 10 or wide receiver at 10, and you get to the second round and there's a tackle or a guard you look at and you really like a Cooper Beebe, Jordan Morgan, Patrick Paul, Cedric Van Pran, David Mahogany. I'm trying to think of another example of a tackle that could go in that range. Dominic Cooney, whoever it is that you like, that you think could be a really good tackler guard. You have the flexibility now. I mean, you sort of did before, but now you really do. You have the flexibility that you could make a move back into the second round from the third and grab somebody there. Because I've heard people say, like our buddy Dom C, well, you have to pick a tackle at 10 because you won't get as good of a tackle, but the class is loaded with wide receivers. I get that to an extent, but ultimately you can't be using the 10th pick on what amounts to somebody who is a contingency plan in 2024. So you could go the other way, because I do think that it's a stacked offensive line class in the first couple of rounds. So if you need to trade from 72 to get up into the second round and make a move that way, you could do it. I'd rather do that than using the 10th pick on a guy that you're hoping doesn't even have to play this year.
Yeah, a few people have asked, and I see a couple people in the chat, or like I said earlier on Twitter, it was brought up to me. I've seen it mentioned on the Jet Nation message boards, and somebody asking, does Brock Bowers' size concern you? D Bakes. Bowers is undersized. You know, they say he's going to come in at 6'2.5", 6'3", smaller than most tight ends nowadays. But
he measured in it. Didn't he measure in? I'm sorry to interrupt you, Glenn. Didn't he measure in at like 6'3", 6'3.5" at the combine or something?
Okay, I missed that because I know he didn't do a lot, and I was looking toward his pro day where they said he was going to do everything. But you may be right. I think.
While you talk, I'm going to look that up. While you talk, I'll look that up.
Yeah, great. And yeah, whether it's if he's an inch or two shorter than you'd like him to be, you can't take guys off your draft board or not take guys over an inch or two in their height. Daniel Jeremiah, who I think is probably the most respected voice out there in the draft world. People tend to what's the word? Mel Kiper seems to get made fun of quite a bit. I still don't mind Kiper's work. I think he's one of those guys, when you put your work out there, it's easy for people to remember it and make fun of you, but, act like nobody ever misses on draft picks. Kiper misses. Everybody misses. Ozzie Newsome missed. But if you look at Daniel Jeremiah's top 50, he's currently got Brock Bowers as the number 7 player in the entire class. So that's how worried he is about Bowers' size. I'm not worried about his size. You look at the way he separates. You look at his power when he's running with the ball. His lower half is very strong. He's a tough guy to bring down. That's why you see his yak numbers are so high. Probably the best yak tight end in the class. And he's just a guy who makes play. His hands are some of the catches you see Brock Bowers make are absolutely ridiculous. And he's making these catches, whether he's 6'2.5" or 6'3.5" or 6'4", whatever he may be, he's making these catches. So Bowers is, as we've said, a day one impact difference maker. Whereas a tackle is a guy who might play, who might not play, and it is a pick that has a vision of looking toward the future. And I don't see how anyone can look at the way this team is made up and suggest that the Jets go into this looking toward the future with the number 10 pick. Scott, you're frozen. I don't know if you want to pop out and back in, but we're not getting you right now. So there you go. You're back. So yeah, Bowers.
Glad you got me now.
The size doesn't worry me one bit.
Yeah, it's because I left. Yeah, Glenn, I left to check on his size. He was 6'3", 243 at the combine. So yeah, it's a little smaller than you like, but you know who he's very similar to from a size perspective? Dallas Clark, who he's run a lot of comparisons to. Now, some people will say, do you want to use the 10th pick on Dallas Clark? Look, I think Dallas Clark, who is a former All-Pro, by the way, and who had several double-digit touchdown seasons, and who was a guy that went over 1,000 yards at a certain point. Like, I think Bowers could be better than Dallas Clark. I think the game has changed enough, and I think I think Bowers is probably a better athlete than Clark and better with the yak even. So, like I said, I think if you look at what Laporta did last year, and if Bowers can do something close to that, even if Bowers is a rookie, gives you 800 yards and 6 to 7 touchdowns, right? I mean, that's huge because that's something you're getting to help you immediately in a win now window. And it's giving you somebody who can be a focal point of your offense going forward. And he is a mismatch because, look, even though he's not 6'5", 265 or whatever, Gronk was, I think, 6'7", 275, whatever.
Yeah.
I think Kyle Pitts is 6'5", 255, something like that. Even so, he is still going to be a huge size mismatch with most of these guys, a size and speed mismatch with most of these guys that are going to be covering him. So, look, again, I think if he's there at 10, and if they get a really good offer to trade back, okay. If they make a move to trade up, fine. Unless they have a tackle or a wide receiver that's graded well ahead of him, I think it would be a great pick. And look, I think he's one of those guys. I remember saying Chris Nimbley, the very big deal from Jets Insider, saying this when the Jets drafted Quinnen Williams. I believe he said, Jets fans may not love this pick now, but talk to me in a couple of years. You'll be singing a different tune. And I think if you go back and talk to most Jets fans who didn't love the Quinnen Williams pick then, they probably are singing a different tune right now. And I think that would probably happen. I think the people that would not be in favor of the Bowers pick, and I think for sure it would be controversial, but I think the people that wouldn't be in favor of it probably even maybe as soon as that season or a year or two down the line would change their tune and they would realize that the Jets have a really impactful weapon there. Look, the Jets haven't had a real difference maker at the tight end position since Mickey Schuler. It's been a long time. So it would be nice. And again, think about it. If you have Breece Hall, Mike Williams, Garrett Wilson, and Brock Bowers in there with Tyler Conklin, and even, let's say they get another receiver in the 4th round or something like that, like you could really have a fun offense if Aaron Rodgers stays healthy. This could be the most fun offense the Jets have had in a long time. I was talking to Randy Lang of NewYorkJets.com, and he said it would be the most fun since 2015. But I think it would have the potential to be the most fun really since the 80s because
80s,
honestly, 80s. 2015 was fun. Don't get me wrong, but you still had Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback.
And it was
Ryan
guys
Fitzpatrick
doing all the work. It was Decker and Marshall getting 85% of the targets.
Right, and Ivory was a good player, don't question about it.
Yeah.
But Ivory's not Breece Hall, clearly. And I think, obviously, Aaron Rodgers, look, Kenny O'Brien, 3-time Pro Bowler, he was never Aaron Rodgers. I'm not trying to say that. But Kenny could really air it out. And then you had Wesley Walker and Al Toon and Freeman McNeil and Mickey Schuler and Johnny Hector. That team was loaded with weapons. This would be the most, 98 was pretty good too. You had Keyshawn, Wayne Corbett, Curtis Martin, Vinny was on fire that year. So that was a really good one too. But I think as far as, what that team could be capable of offensively on the high end, you'd be looking at that, 1985, 1986 bar, which was tremendous for those that remember it.
Yeah, there was so much talent on that offense, and this one has the chance to be the same. In the chat, D-Bake says, Glenn, is there any player at 10 you would take over Bowers that would realistically be there? No. I've said from, I think I started maybe last offseason or during the preseason as saying that the 2 top players in this draft that I would take if I were the Jets, and I actually have a tweet that I sent back in December that I retweeted today. I said back then that it's Marvin Harrison, Brock Bowers, or trade down. And Harrison won't be there at 10. So there's not a player realistically that would be there at 10. I didn't think Bowers was going to make it to 10 until the Chargers dumped their top 2 receivers. And then because I thought Jim Harbaugh loves tight ends. Jim Harbaugh at the time had some receivers that he could use. Without any receivers now, I think maybe San Diego goes with a receiver. Some people think they may go O-line. That is a possibility. But I thought Bowers, just looking at, like, you look at Michigan, always stacked at tight end. Like that's a big part of Harbaugh's offense. But they could go tackle. They could go receiver. I think Bowers now makes it to the Jets at 10. And if it's not Marvin Harrison, obviously you're not taking a quarterback. Marvin Harrison isn't making it to 10. You've addressed the O-line. And here's the other part of it, Scott, that drives me crazy. And I think I mention this every year when draft season kicks off. I say it sort of tongue-in-cheek that people need to remember teams get more than one draft pick. When you say, I want this guy, it's, well, then what do we do? Then we're not going to have this or we're not going to have that. There's depth in this year's class. You can get a rookie tackle. Not, unlikely you're going to get a day one starter. Not impossible, but unlikely you're going to get a player of that caliber. But as Scott mentioned, as I've said before, there are some quality veterans out there who have starting experience. I imagine there's an issue as to why not. Given how badly the Jets need O-line help, the fact they haven't brought in Cam Fleming, who did a nice job in Denver under Nate Hackett a couple of years ago. He started 15, 16 games, did a solid job. He plays the left side. He plays the right side. They didn't bring him in last year. They're not bringing him in this year so far. But some of the guys you mentioned, whether it's a Cam Fleming type, there are veterans out there who, if you need to plug them in for 4 or 5 games, they can get the job done. Now, look, if it's like last year again and everyone gets hurt and guys are missing 10, 11, 12, 13 games, that's a different story. As I said last season, I don't know how you prepare by getting yourself 14 starting caliber offensive linemen. That's just not reality. But there is the opportunity to take Bowers, and that doesn't mean you've neglected the O-line and now there's nobody to come in if somebody gets hurt. You go get a veteran who has played before. You've got Super Bowl champions out there. You've got guys who play both positions who can step in. And as we talked about, Scott, last year when we said the Jets should go with Jackson Smith-Njigba, and a big part of our reasoning was his ability to get open right off the line, that agility, that lateral quickness, that he's going to get open in a hurry and the ball is out. That's one of the things that's made Aaron Rodgers so great over the years, is how quickly the ball comes out. And, which is something to watch next year, because really that's kind of how he got hurt last year when the ball didn't come out. But look, if you have Aaron Rodgers and he's playing the way you expect him to, you don't need a bunch of all-pro tackles. You don't know what you're going to get from a rookie. You have a better idea what Cam Fleming is going to give you than you do a rookie who might need a year or two to settle in.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, I think you could get a Josh Jones, a Donovan Smith. You mentioned Cam Fleming, somebody like that. Just somebody who's solid insurance. I mean, listen, obviously there's the possibility of Bakhtiari. I don't love that just because I'm not even convinced Bakhtiari could pass a physical at this point, but I guess we'll see what happens. But yeah, man, look, Brock Bowers is an interesting case too, in the sense that he wasn't really a contested catch guy at Georgia. I want to see what his vertical leap looks like when he does his pro day, because if he has a good vertical leap, I think to me that seals all doubt, because if his vertical leap is good, that means there's no reason that you can't develop him into a contested catch guy. If his vertical leap's not good, then maybe you sit there and worry that he's basically Mike Gesicki, which I know our friend Joe Blewett has said. He's a little nervous that Bowers might just be Mike Gesicki, which is not the worst thing in the world, by the way, but you would aim higher with the 10th overall pick in the draft, obviously. So I'm curious to see that. But I think getting at 10, who could realistically be there? Look, certain things happen in the draft, and you never really know how the chips are going to fall. If J.J. McCarthy winds up going in the top 6, or if Bowers goes to the Chargers instead of a receiver, because it's possible that happens, and then maybe a receiver falls down, or who knows, or they get a good trade-off or whatever, I don't know. But at the moment, I mean, Bowers on paper makes a lot of sense for them. So we'll see. The thing that's interesting to me about Bowers too, Glenn, is that he was the guy that was basically considered the best tight end in college football for 3 years. And he was actually the best college football tight end for 3 years. Like, people were talking about him like, oh, this guy, but every year he was there, he was the best tight end in college football. So it's kind of one of those things where he kind of met the hype. And now I've said that Bowers kind of reminds me a little bit of like a Kyle Hamilton or somebody like that, where Tyler Linderbaum would be another example, where you have a guy who's been talked about for a really long time as being this special talent. And then as you get closer, people start nitpicking him and saying, I don't know. He's not as fast as we thought. I don't know. He's not as tall as we thought. I don't know. His arms aren't as long as we thought. I don't know. And they don't look at the tape and go, wow, this guy could really do some things. They nitpick to the point where he drops to 15 or 18 or whatever. And then the Ravens or a smart team like that jump in and grab him and steal him and get a great value. And that's what happened with Kyle Hamilton, who's one of the top safeties in the NFL right now. People talk themselves out of him. Linderbaum was another one. I think he went the end of the first round. There was talk at one point that the Jets might consider him in the top 10. And people talked themselves out of him because they said his arms weren't that long or whatever. You could go through the list of a lot of different guys that have been talked down for a variety of reasons. They nitpicked his 40 time or his arm length or any of those things. And then that guy winds up being really good. I think this would be a case with Bowers where he could fall to a point where somebody takes him and then a year or two later, everybody goes, how did this guy drop like that? Like, we all knew what he could do at Georgia. Why did teams overlook him? And then it just becomes, well, you know, and because didn't Kyle Hamilton run like a 4.6 or something like that?
Really
and then all these teams were like, oh,
yeah.
You're like, yeah, he might even be a linebacker. I don't know if he's even a safety, you know, that kind of thing. So
and Brian
I think Bowers is the kind of guy where a lot of
40 and fall.
Yeah, and look how good he was last year. He was a guy that at one point you thought the Jets might consider it at 13 or then 15, whatever. And then he slipped because I think you said his 40 time. And look, he was really, really good with Detroit last year. Big part of why they were able to go all the way to the NFC Championship game. So, yeah, I think Bowers is the type of player where teams will outsmart themselves, and they just have had so much time to nitpick this guy. But if I'll tell you this, whether you like it or you don't like it, if they pick Bowers, I think he'd be making plays in training camp that would instantly start getting attention, and Jets fans would start getting excited pretty quickly. That you might see a lot of this, like, well, I wasn't all in on the Bowers pick, but boy, this kid looks pretty damn good. I think that's probably what you would get a lot of. Now, obviously, the big question here is Aaron Rodgers, right? Because you've seen people posting, here are Rodgers' numbers with tight ends. Does he really do a lot with tight ends? And yeah, Jermichael Finley was pretty good. For the most part, though, Rodgers just didn't have good tight ends. So the question is, was that by design? Does Rodgers just not really value the tight end? Or is it just he didn't have the tight ends he needed to really? So that's the question. Now, if Aaron Rodgers, if they're talking to Rodgers and they're like, what do you think about this Bowers kid? And he says, well, I'm not really going to do much with him. I don't really like to use the tight end. Well, then you don't pick him, obviously. That's a different story. But if Rodgers watches this kid and says, yeah, this kid would be a great mismatch for me, and he makes sense because Bowers can go downfield and get balls, and he can also take short passes and stretch the field with. Yeah, the yak is big. Brian Bassett had a great point from There's Always Next Year. He does a podcast on Play Like a Jet, and I call him the Podfather because he's the godfather of Jets podcasts. I think he was the first one I remember that did one on the old Jets blog. But he said, if you want to know what the number one indicator of whether a tight end will be successful in the NFL is, it's can he get yak? Because if you have a tight end that can get yak, you know that he can at least do something for you. You know that he's not going to be completely worthless, right? The odds of him being a bust are very low if he can get you yak. And that's one of Bauer's biggest strengths. So it'll be interesting. But I think as we get closer, we'll see what happens. There's going to be a lot of smoke around these quarterbacks. I wonder if even Bo Nix is going to start to get some buzz. And Glenn, I'll tell you, this is an interesting theoretical too. What if Michael Penix Jr. is on the board at 72? Do the Jets consider that? I don't know. I mean, it's worth thinking about.
I think you consider him at 72. It's his health is the only thing. Even if you can say a guy's medical's checked out and that's fine, but what he hit two ACLs or something like that, that's a big deal. That's but at 72,
right.
Look,
but at 72, right?
More risk later in the draft.
Yeah, because think about it too, right? He's the kind of guy, like, by all accounts, very smart kid, a sponge, learns well. He's not super mobile. He's more really just a pocket passer and all that. Reminds me a little bit, honestly, of Geno Smith. But if you could stand behind Rodgers for a year or two, you have the luxury of time with him because at quarterback, here's the thing, right? A guy could be 25 or 26 and make his first start, and that's okay because you could have a guy at 26 that could still give you a decade in the league.
People
So,
get so caught up on age, and I don't get that with quarterbacks. Like you said,
well,
Scott, you can get a decade out of a guy.
it matters to an extent, right? In the sense that if you're picking him really high, you prefer that he's younger because you could get him for more years and all that. And you know that there's probably more upside with a younger guy. With an older prospect, you're probably looking at as close to a finished product as you're going to get. If it's an older guy and he hasn't had as many starts or something like that, that's different. But in the case of Penix, the injury could drop him down. Whereas if he was healthy, maybe he's a late first round type of guy or something. 72, it's worth thinking about. I mean, because again, like you said, age early on, maybe it's something you really consider. By the time you get to the third round with a quarterback, you don't worry so much. I think
I like the idea of Jordan Travis at what is it? I think he might be there at like 111, wherever they are at that spot.
Yeah,
if he's there.
Yeah.
But
I'm just throwing Penix out there for sure. I'm just throwing Penix out there as a possibility because a lot of people, especially after that game against the Texas, they had him as, oh my God, this guy's amazing. He should be the first quarterback picked. And you know how it is. Everybody overreacts after stuff like that. But I think there's a lot of people had thought first round pick. I think there's a decent possibility he's there in the third round. I don't think people have talked about it. So it's just something to think about because I never thought the Jets would be in that route because of the fact that I didn't think they'd be able to fill this many needs in free agency. But now that they have, you could consider something that you wouldn't have in the past.
Yeah, and Penix is a good one. I saw, what was it, Sports Illustrated or somebody like that a few weeks ago did a mock where they had the Jets taking a quarterback at 72, but it was Bo Nix. And I thought, Bo Nix is not going to be there at 72. Bo Nix, there's talk. I said I thought if he had a strong Senior Bowl, he had a shot going top 10. He didn't have a great Senior Bowl, but in recent weeks we've seen a lot of people say maybe Denver, maybe Sean Payton in Denver looking for a quarterback. And Bo Nix last year, say what you will about the conference he played in and the offense and the style and all that. I saw a number that if you account for his drops, the drops his receivers had, and the spikes and all that, his completion percentage would have been over 80%, which is nuts because it's not like they're dinking and dunking. Like he airs it out. So he throws for 1,000,000 yards, completed or hit on 80%. So D-Bake says, is there any chance the Jets go defense in the first round? Can't see that happening.
No, I can't imagine that would be the case. By the way, as far as Bo Nix goes, it's interesting. Not a lot of air yards with him. There was a stat I have to look. It was, I believe, Jaden Daniels had more touchdowns of 20 plus yards on the season than Bo Nix had completions of 20 plus air yards on the season. It was something like that.
When I watched Nix, they threw the ball down the field, and a lot of it was at Auburn too. But I felt like Oregon threw the ball down the field.
Yeah. I got to look at that again, but there was a really interesting stat that I saw there. But look, this is the thing, right? The average pass is within 15 yards in the NFL. So you don't have to be a guy that just bombs it out. You want to be a guy that has the ability to do it if you have to, but you also, for the most part, are going to be throwing passes that aren't 30, 40 yards downfield. So it's good to have in your arsenal, but it's not the most important thing. So it's interesting to see how teams evaluate Nix. If he gets artificially pushed up and McCarthy gets artificially pushed up, could help the Jets in a variety of different ways. Maybe somebody wants to trade up ahead of them to get those guys. Maybe someone wants to trade up with them to get one of those guys, and they can slide back. Look, how great would this scenario be? What if the Jets slid back a pick or two with the Vikings or the Broncos who were looking for Nix or McCarthy? The Jets slide back to 12 and still get Brock Bowers and pick up an extra third-round pick or something. I mean, that to me would be the greatest scenario you could come up with.
I think we're going to see the Vikings jump over the Jets.
They might. I mean, that's what look, the issue with the Vikings to me is going to be I don't think they're going to be able to get into the top 3. So the question is going to be, do they want to make a move up to get a J.J. McCarthy or a Bo Nix? I'm not high enough on either one of those two that I would make a bold move like that, but maybe that's where they're at. I don't know. It's going to be interesting because I don't see the Patriots, the Bears, or Washington moving out of those picks. I think they're going to take a quarterback. New England has said several times. They've said, they've indicated that they want a quarterback. I mean, unless they're the only other way I could see it is if they rationalize it that they're going to go with Brissett for a year. Or here's the other thing they could do. They could sort of do what the Browns did, although it didn't work out for them. You remember when they passed on Brady Quinn for Ted Ginn Jr. and everybody went nuts? And then the Browns traded back into the first round at the end and got Brady Quinn. You could see something like that. Like maybe the Patriots take Marvin Harrison Jr. instead, and then they trade back into the first round to get Bo Nix or something if they like Bo Nix. Like, so maybe that, but I would be surprised if any of those teams are moving out of those picks. So if someone's moving up, there's a good chance it's for McCarthy or Nix, which would be kind of crazy.
Yeah, we'll wrap up one more question that from the chat here from Charles, and he's asking. He's basically saying Williams is a great move. He likes the idea of Brian Thomas. Now we've already seen one Brian Thomas get drafted by the Jets, Scott. Some of the younger fans will not have had that opportunity. But what are your thoughts about the possibility of Brian Thomas at wide receiver?
Yeah, I like Brian Thomas a lot. I think him and I like Adonai Mitchell better. Admittedly, I might be somewhat biased because I'm a Texas fan. But I just think with Adonai Mitchell, when you have a guy with that kind of speed and size and hands and ability to run, like there was one route, I'm forgetting who it was against, and it was a bad pass by Quinn Ewers, so it went incomplete. I'll have to find the clip and I'll send it to you, Glenn, and we can post it on Twitter. Maybe we can post it on your Jets Picks account. But he just left this guy in his dust so bad. And if Ewers was even close on the throw, it's a touchdown, if I remember correctly. And like a guy like that, Brian Thomas, another one. I mean, Brian Thomas, those guys are what, 6'3", 6'4". They ran a 4.3. There's so much you could do with guys like that. I mean, and look at even what Romeo Doubs, who has that kind of size in Green Bay, has started to do. And he was not a route runner at all in college in Nevada. He couldn't run any routes. In fact, that was the reason he went where he went, is because everybody just said he's a 9-route guy. He's just another one of these Robbie Anderson types. You don't have to worry about anything with him other than covering him deep, but they've developed him into a guy that looks like he could have the makings of a future number 1 type wide receiver in Green Bay, sort of like how they did it with Devontae Adams, who was a second-round pick, and Jordy Nelson, and Donald Driver, and Greg Jennings, and all these guys over the years. So it's something to think about. But look, if they traded down and took Thomas or Adonai Mitchell, I mean, I would have a hard time being upset about that.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. If you're thinking receiver in this class, you can absolutely trade down and get somebody, because we've talked so much about the depth of the offensive line in this class, but receiver is right up there too. And guys you can get late. Another Texas guy who, when you were talking earlier, Scott, about we're picking guys apart for too long, and maybe that's why people have kind of lost sight of Bowers. A guy, I think it was during his freshman year that I first messaged you about him, because I knew you were a Texas guy, was Xavier Worthy. And until he ran, like, I've been watching him and talking about him for a couple of years, and he ran that 40 at the combine. I'm like, I've kind of stopped talking about this guy, because in my mind, he's so obviously an elite weapon. It's like, well, that sort of literally goes without saying. I haven't mentioned him in months. Yeah. And then he runs that 40, and I'm like, I probably haven't talked about him in forever, and he needs to be getting more hype.
Yeah, the thing for me with Xavier Worthy is he's one of these guys that came in with so much hype because of his unbelievable athleticism, like you said. And he's flashed at times, but he's one of those guys that with the right coaching could become a really, really, really good player in the NFL. But I also feel like there is a possibility that he doesn't develop into the type of wide receiver that you hope. And that I think Adonai Mitchell is a much safer player, is what I'll say.
Yeah.
Xavier Worthy probably has the higher ceiling, but I think Mitchell and Thomas are safer players, and they also have very high ceilings too. So that's why I would go with one of them over Worthy. But look, if you get a guy like Worthy, you know what he can do with the ball in his hands, theoretically. It's just a matter of he's gotta be coached up. And the question is, are the Jets the team that could do that? I don't know, but he certainly has the makings of a guy that could become a special weapon in the NFL if he develops the rest of his game. But I think that was what it was watching him. For me as a Texas fan, I get frustrated because sometimes I feel like there should be more there that there wasn't, you know?
Yeah, I get you. But we'll wrap this one up. Scott Mason, thanks so much for coming on and joining us. Be sure to tune into Jet Nation Radio tomorrow night. Myself, Dylan Terman, Chris Schubert. We are going to be speaking with Zach Rosenblatt of The Athletic, talk about the Jets offseason, free agency, things like that. Scott, let people know where they can get you, where they can tune in.
Yeah, man. Twitter is Play Like a Jet 1. You can download the podcast 7 days a week anywhere where you get podcasts. We're doing some fun shows. Glenn, you'll be back on. We'll be doing a mailbag soon. So you'll get a double dose of me and Glenn this week. And then, you can check our YouTube channel, youtube.com/playlikeajet. Our store is teepublic.com. That's teepublic.com. And then you just search Play Like a Jet. Lots of stuff going on. And right now we're still doing the free agency stuff, sort of wrapping that up. And then we're going to get into a lot more draft content, and that'll be fun for about a month. And then, Glenn, last year, obviously, huge curveball from the Jets. In 2022, the picks weren't crazy surprising. It was a little bit surprising that they moved up from the second round. It was a little bit surprising that they drafted Breece Hall as high as they did. Some people thought they might wait a little bit to draft a running back. But last year was a huge shock. I don't think anybody thought they were picking an edge rusher, and Will McDonald certainly wasn't on anybody's list of potential targets. This year, we'll see. Is it going to be a curveball? Is it going to be something that makes sense on paper? We'll find out, but it'll be a fun journey.
Absolutely. Draft time, always a good time. And I'll tell you what, one thing I've noticed, Scott, now that I try to, I've always talked about the draft and watch prospects, but until I had access to all 22 and retired and had the time for it, it was mostly I'm watching highlights. But now that I have the time and the resources with Caddy's cut-ups and I can watch all 22, the draft gets here quick now because I feel like I have the opportunity to be familiar with a few hundred players by the time the draft rolls around. And when you're trying to get that caught up, you look up and it's like the draft is like I feel like it's going to be here in 10 minutes because there's still a lot of guys I got to watch. Yeah. Even having a couple hundred sort of up here already. But that'll wrap this one up. Be sure to check Scott out, playlikeajet.com. Check us out tomorrow, Wednesday night. David, good to see you in the chat. More than happy. Have a good one, Jets fans.